Hello, everyone, and welcome to Midnight Whispers. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfortable, take a slow breath, and let's begin. I was 11 years old, still young enough to believe that home was the safest place in the world, the kind of place where nothing truly bad could happen, as long as the doors were locked and the lights were off. That night started quietly, almost forgettably, which somehow makes everything that followed feel even more disturbing when I look back on it now. My mom wasn't home, and I was alone in the house, something that didn't happen very often. She had gone out for a short while, and I remember her explaining it carefully, making sure I understood how to lock the doors and what not to do while she was gone. I nodded like I was confident and grown, even though being alone always made me a little uneasy. The house felt bigger when no one else was there. Every sound seemed louder, every shadow darker. I tried to distract myself the way kids do, watching TV, flipping channels, telling myself it was no big deal. Eventually, the tiredness caught up with me. I remember lying down and thinking I would just rest my eyes for a moment. I didn't plan to fall asleep, but I did, drifting off in that half-awake, half-dreaming way that only kids seem to manage so easily. I don't know how much time passed before I woke up, but it was sudden and sharp, like my body knew something was wrong before my mind caught up. At first, I thought I was still dreaming. There was a noise, heavy and jarring, coming from the front of the house. It didn't sound like the normal creaks or settling noises houses make at night. This was louder, more deliberate. Then it happened again. A hard, forceful sound like someone was throwing their weight against the front door. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I lay there, frozen, listening. Another bang hit the door, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone trying to force it open. At 11 years old, your imagination doesn't need much help. My mind went straight to the worst possibilities, and fear wrapped around me so tightly it felt hard to breathe. I got out of bed as quietly as I could, my legs shaking beneath me. Every step felt too loud, even though I was barely moving. I crept closer to the hallway, straining to hear. The sounds were real. Someone was absolutely trying to get into the house. This wasn't a mistake, or someone knocking on the wrong door. This was violent and intentional. I remember feeling very small in that moment. The house that had felt familiar and safe just minutes earlier suddenly felt like a maze with no real place to hide. I thought about my mom and how long it might be before she came back. I didn't know what to do except one thing that had been drilled into me over and over: call for help. I grabbed the phone with trembling hands and dialed 911. My fingers felt clumsy, like they didn't belong to me anymore. When the operator answered, I tried to speak calmly, but my voice shook no matter how hard I tried to control it. I told them someone was trying to break into my house. I told them I was alone. I remember the operator's voice staying steady and calm, telling me help was on the way, telling me to find a place to hide and stay on the line if I could. I looked around, my mind racing. My eyes landed on the pantry. It was small, cramped, and dark, but it was close, and it had a door. I ran to it and climbed inside, curling myself into the bottom shelf, pulling my knees to my chest. I tried to make myself as small as possible. Like if I took up less space, I might somehow be less noticeable. From inside the pantry, everything sounded louder. I could still hear the front door being hit, the wood straining under the force. I pressed my hand over my mouth to keep myself from crying or making any noise. I remember thinking that I needed to be quiet, that being quiet was the most important thing in the world. Then the sounds changed. The banging at the front door stopped, and for a brief, terrifying moment, everything went silent. That silence felt worse than the noise. My mind filled it with images of the door finally giving way, of someone stepping inside, and of footsteps moving closer. A moment later, I heard movement near the pantry. My stomach dropped when I realized there was another door near where I was hiding. I could hear them trying that door too, rattling it, pushing against it. They were so close, close enough that I felt like they could hear my breathing, even though I was barely daring to breathe at all. I remember squeezing my eyes shut, silently begging for the police to get there in time. I didn't know how much longer the doors would hold. I didn't know what would happen if they got inside. At 11 years old, your sense of control disappears completely in moments like that. You are just a child, hiding, hoping that adults you've never met will arrive before it's too late. Time felt strange then. Every second stretched out endlessly, while at the same time everything felt like it was happening too fast. I stayed frozen in that pantry, listening to the sounds, listening to the operator's voice through the phone, reminding me to stay hidden, telling me help was coming. And then, finally, there were new sounds, sirens in the distance. The noise outside changed again. The person trying to get in stopped. There was shouting, voices I didn't recognize but instantly trusted. The police had arrived. I don't remember leaving the pantry. I don't remember opening the door or standing up. I just remember being found. One of the officers picked me up, lifting me into his arms like I weighed nothing at all. I clung to him without thinking, wrapping my arms around his neck and holding on as tightly as I could. I was shaking so badly, my teeth were chattering. He didn't try to pull away. He didn't tell me to calm down or put me down. He just held me. I remember him speaking softly, telling me I was safe now, that everything was okay, that my mom was on her way. I buried my face into his shoulder and cried in a way I don't think I ever had before. When my mom arrived, I still wouldn't let go. Even when I saw her, even when I knew she was there, my body refused to release its grip. The officer stayed patient, staying close, making sure I felt safe enough before finally letting go. That moment, that kindness, stayed with me in a quiet but powerful way. After that night, nothing was ever quite the same. Life went on, as it always does, but something inside me had shifted. The world felt less predictable. Safety felt more fragile. Being alone no longer felt neutral or calm. It felt dangerous. As I grew older, people around me probably assumed I had moved on. Kids are resilient, they say. And in some ways, that's true. I went to school, I made friends, I laughed, I lived my life. But the fear stayed, tucked away just beneath the surface. I avoided being home alone whenever I could. If my mom had to go somewhere, I would ask to come with her or find an excuse to stay with a friend. Nights were the hardest. Falling asleep alone brought back memories of waking up to those sounds, of being trapped in fear before I even understood what was happening. Even as an adult, the effects followed me. I'm 27 now, and I still don't stay home alone very often. It's not something I talk about openly, because it feels hard to explain without sounding overly cautious or dramatic. But trauma doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it just quietly shapes your choices. The day I signed the lease for my first apartment should have been exciting. And it was, but it was also terrifying. The idea of being alone in my own space brought back feelings I hadn't felt so strongly in years. I knew I needed something to make it feel safer. something to remind me that I wasn't alone. That's the day I got my dog. It wasn't a long, drawn-out decision. It felt necessary, almost instinctive. Having another living being in the apartment made a difference I can't fully put into words. The sound of paws on the floor, the quiet presence, the feeling that someone else was there with me helped calm the part of my brain that never fully forgot that night. Even now, when things go bump in the night, my heart still races. I still double-check locks. I still feel that old fear sometimes, creeping in when the house is quiet. But I also know where it comes from, and I've learned to live with it rather than fight it. What happened to me at 11 years old shaped me in ways I didn't understand back then. It taught me how deeply fear can settle into your body, especially when you're young. It taught me that trauma doesn't always fade with time. Sometimes it just changes shape. I don't think about that night every day, but it's part of me. It's part of how I understand safety, trust, and vulnerability. And when I look back on it now, I don't think about how brave I was or how lucky I was, even though maybe I was both. I think about how terrifying it is to be a child facing something you can't control, and how important it is that someone showed up when I needed them most. That night took away some of my innocence, but it also showed me kindness in the middle of fear. And in a strange way, that balance is what I carry with me now. It happened to me. It was the fall of 2002, and Baton Rouge was living under a kind of fear I've never felt before or since. The city was on edge because of one man, the Baton Rouge serial killer. Every news broadcast talked about him. Every conversation eventually drifted back to him. Women were warned not to jog alone, not to shop alone at night, not to park near wooded areas or lakes. The FBI was involved. Profiles were circulating. Rumors spread faster than facts. The fear wasn't abstract anymore. It felt personal, like the city itself was holding its breath. One night, my girlfriend called me. The moment I heard her voice, I knew something was wrong. She was panicked, barely able to get the words out. She told me she had just left Walmart and that a white pickup truck was following her. Not just casually, behind her in traffic, but following her, matching every turn, staying close. At the time, the FBI had publicly stated that the killer might be driving a white pickup truck. That detail had burned itself into everyone's mind. So when she said those words, my stomach dropped. She told me she had already tried to lose him. She had driven in circles. She had gone into cul-de-sacs and back out again. She had taken turns that made no sense unless you were trying to see if someone was tailing you. The truck stayed with her every time. She was crying. She was terrified. And I could hear it in her voice that this wasn't just nerves. She knew deep down that something was very wrong. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my best friend and we jumped into his car and tore across town. I don't remember how fast we were going, only that every red light felt like it was trying to kill us. My phone stayed glued to my ear as I tried to keep her calm, telling her to keep driving, not to pull over, not to go home yet. A few minutes later, we caught up. We were exiting on Dalrymple when I saw her car ahead of us. She drove right past me, and right behind her, close enough that there was no doubt anymore, was the white pickup truck. Seeing it with my own eyes made the situation suddenly real in a way it hadn't been over the phone. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't imagination. This was happening. She was house-sitting for a wealthy relative who lived nearby in a quiet, upscale neighborhood close to the LSU lakes. I called her and told her we were behind the truck now, that she should head straight there. She pulled into the driveway, I shaking so badly she could barely park. The truck didn't pull in behind her. It stopped one house earlier. It parked right on the edge of the LSU lakes. That detail still chills me. We pulled in behind her car. She jumped out, completely hysterical, crying, barely able to stand. I wrapped my arms around her and tried to ground her, telling her it was probably nothing, probably some idiot following the wrong car. LSU's campus was right there, after all. Students everywhere, people driving around at all hours. I wanted to believe that explanation, as much as she did. My roommate stood on the porch, watching everything. My best friend stayed close. And I did the one thing that, looking back, could have gone very badly. I walked toward the truck. As I got closer, I could see the driver inside. He wouldn't look directly at me. His face stayed angled away, eyes darting sideways. I remember feeling a strange mix of fear and relief at the same time, because when I got close enough to see him clearly, I realized he was an African-American man. At that time, the FBI profile said the killer was white. That fact washed over me like a wave of relief. I immediately told myself we had been wrong. That fear had filled in the blanks. That this was just a misunderstanding fueled by a terrified city and a frightened woman driving alone at night. I told him calmly that he had scared my girlfriend. I explained that she thought she was being followed and that he had likely just been behind the wrong car leaving Walmart. He didn't respond much. He gave me a brief, side-eyed glance. No apology, no explanation, just a look that I couldn't quite read. Then he drove off. We stood there for a long time after that, watching his taillights disappear. My girlfriend eventually calmed down enough to go inside. I stayed with her for a while, making sure she was okay. Eventually, we all convinced ourselves that it had been a coincidence. A misunderstanding amplified by fear and tension, and a city already primed to expect the worst. Life went on. I never saw that man again in person. But the following year, everything came rushing back. I opened a newspaper and saw his face staring back at me from the front page. It was everywhere. Television, print, online. The arrest that finally ended Baton Rouge's nightmare. DNA evidence had identified the killer. His name was Derek Todd Lee. The realization hit me like a physical blow. That was him. The man in the white pickup truck. The man parked by the LSU lakes. The man who wouldn't look me in the eye. The man I had stood a few feet away from, talking to him like he was just another guy who'd made a mistake. I replayed that night over and over in my head. Every detail took on a new weight. The way he followed her so persistently. The way he stopped just short of her driveway. The way he parked by the water. The way he avoided eye contact. The way he drove off without a word. The FBI profile had been wrong. And because of that, I had let my guard down. The thought that still haunts me the most is how close it all came. How easily that night could have ended differently. If we hadn't gotten there when we did. If she had pulled over. If she had gone somewhere isolated instead of a well-lit neighborhood. If he had decided to do something before we arrived. I think about how casually I approached that truck. How confident I felt once I thought the profile didn't match. How unaware I was that I was standing face to face with a man who had already taken lives and would have taken more if he hadn't been caught. People talk about serial killers like they're monsters you can spot from a mile away. Like there's something obvious about them, something visibly wrong. That night taught me how false that idea is. Sometimes they're just a man in a truck, parked on a quiet street, blending into the background of a terrified city. I had a run-in with Derek Todd Lee. And I didn't know it until it was far too late. Sorry to interrupt for just a moment. If you're new here, consider subscribing to Midnight Whispers for daily true horror stories that stay with you long after they're told, quietly unsettling and meant for the late hours. You can also turn on notifications so you're always here when a new story arrives and the night begins to stir again. Now, let's continue. In the place I used to live, there were a couple of things that happened that never really left me. They weren't things I witnessed directly, but they were close enough, familiar enough, that they settled into my mind and stayed there. Even now, years later, when I think about that neighborhood, those are the moments that surface first. One of them happened in the very apartment building where I lived. It was the middle of the night, sometime around 2 in the morning. Most of the building was asleep. Later on, we learned that a man who lived there, a police officer, had gotten into a vicious fight with his wife. The kind of fight where voices echo through walls and doors slam hard enough to shake picture frames. I didn't hear it myself that night, which I'm grateful for, but some of the neighbors did. They said it went on for a long time, rising and falling, the sound of a marriage tearing itself apart behind closed doors. At some point during the argument, the man grabbed their young son. The kid was only 3 or 4 years old. He bundled him into the car and drove him across town to his brother's place. The uncle was confused and half asleep when they arrived. But when the man explained that things were bad between him and his wife, the uncle didn't question it. He took the boy in, assuming that by morning things would cool down and the parents would sort it out like adults. The man then went back to the apartment. Whatever happened after that was final. More yelling, more fighting, and then gunshots. He shot his wife, then he shot himself. By the time anyone fully understood what had happened, it was already over. Police cars, ambulances, flashing lights in the dark. The kind of scene you see on the news and never expect to happen in the building where you sleep. I was lucky enough to sleep through it, but the neighbors closest to that apartment weren't. They heard everything. The arguments, the shots, the silence afterward. Some of them moved out not long after. Others stayed. But they were never quite the same. You could see it in their faces, in how quiet they became, in how they avoided eye contact in the hallway. What stuck with me the most was the son. That little boy had been spared the worst of it by pure chance. If his father hadn't driven him away in the middle of the night, he would have been there. He would have heard it. He might have seen it. Instead, he slept on his uncle's couch, completely unaware that his life had just split into a before and an after that could never be stitched back together. The days that followed were strange in a way that's hard to describe, unless you've lived through something similar. The building was still standing. People still went to work, took out the trash, waited for the elevator. On the surface, everything looked the same, but the atmosphere had shifted. It felt heavier. Conversations were quieter. Doors closed more gently, or sometimes more carefully, as if everyone was suddenly aware of how thin the walls really were. There were rumors, of course, people trying to make sense of it. Some said the marriage had been troubled for years. Others claimed they'd heard shouting before, late at night, but hadn't thought much of it at the time. A few people expressed anger. They're asking why someone who carried a gun for a living hadn't gotten help sooner. Others focused on the wife, on what she must have endured in that relationship. Everyone had an opinion, but no one really had answers. What no one argued about was the child. Every conversation eventually circled back to him, to where he was now, to how he would grow up, to whether he would remember any of it. People speculated about therapy, about foster care, about whether his uncle would be able to give him a stable life. Some hoped he was young enough that it wouldn't stay with him. Others quietly doubted that. Trauma doesn't always need clear memories to leave a mark. Sometimes, when I walked past that apartment door, I found myself slowing down without meaning to. The door looked the same as every other door in the hallway. Same color, same handle, and same faint scuff marks near the bottom. But knowing what had happened behind it changed everything. It felt wrong to stand there for too long, like lingering might somehow disturb something that was already settled. Eventually, new people moved in. Life went on, the way it always does, but that story became part of the building's identity, even if it was never spoken out loud again. It lived in glances, in pauses, in the way some neighbors would stiffen if they heard raised voices through the walls, even when it was just a TV or an argument that went nowhere. The second event happened just a block away at a friend's apartment building. That building had a very distinct layout. The ground floor was covered in bright white tiles, almost glossy. To get anywhere, whether you were leaving the building or heading to another apartment, you had to pass through a large common area. From that space, you could look up and see all the balconies stacked above, floor after floor, like a vertical grid. It was open, airy, and usually filled with the sound of footsteps and voices echoing softly off the tile. It was the kind of place that felt communal. People crossed paths there all the time. Neighbors nodded at each other, exchanged quick greetings, sometimes stopped to talk. Kids ran through it. People waited there for rides. It was meant to be a neutral space, a shared part of daily life. One night, a woman who lived there jumped from the top of the building. There was no warning for most people. No announcement. No build-up that anyone noticed. Just a scream that cut through the air, sharp and sudden, followed by a sound that didn't quite make sense at first. A sound that was too loud, too final, too wrong to be anything else. People rushed out of their apartments. Some froze where they stood. Others ran forward without really knowing why. Someone screamed again. Someone else started crying. Phones came out. Sirens followed not long after. Later it came out that the woman had been suffering from severe depression. Friends talked about how she'd been struggling, how she'd seemed distant, how she'd tried to hide it, or maybe how they hadn't known what to look for. Those conversations always come later, once the shock settles enough for people to speak. But at the time, none of that mattered. What mattered was what people saw when they looked down. The next day, it was all over the local news. A tragic headline, a short article, a few quotes from police. The kind of story that exists for one news cycle before being replaced by the next tragedy. For people who didn't live there, it was just another sad thing that happened somewhere else. For the people who did live there, it was impossible to forget. My friend lived in that building. When she first told me about it, she didn't give details. She didn't dramatize it. She just looked different, like something in her had dimmed. After a long pause, she said, almost under her breath, "Red." There was red splattered everywhere. She didn't say anything else. That sentence alone was enough to make my stomach drop. Later, when I visited her, she asked if I wanted to see something. I didn't really know what she meant until we walked down into the common area. The space looked clean at first glance. Too clean. Like someone had put a lot of effort into making it look normal again. She pointed to the floor. The white tiles weren't truly white anymore. There were faint stains, uneven and patchy, darker than the rest. They weren't obvious unless you knew to look for them. But once you saw them, you couldn't unsee them. They didn't look like dirt or wear. They looked like something had soaked in and refused to leave. She said, "Yeah, it's exactly what you're thinking it is. They cleaned it as well as they could, but some stains never came off. Standing there, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Horror, sadness, and a kind of quiet anger that I didn't fully understand. This wasn't a crime scene hidden behind tape or walls. This was a space people had to walk through every day. A place where life continued, even though something unimaginably final had happened there. I couldn't help but imagine the moment itself. The fall, the suddenness, the way gravity takes over without mercy. The sound echoing through that open space. The way people must have screamed, frozen, run, or turned away. It felt wrong to stand there too long, but it also felt wrong to walk away too quickly. After that, my friend told me she avoided the common area whenever she could. She took different routes. She timed her comings and goings to avoid passing through when others were around. She said that sometimes late at night, the building felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath. Eventually, she moved out. She never said outright that the incident was the reason, but it didn't need to be said. Some places become unbearable once you associate them with certain memories. No amount of cleaning or repainting can undo that. Those two events changed how I saw that neighborhood. Before, it had just been a place, buildings, streets, sidewalks, people living their lives side by side, mostly unaware of each other. Afterward, it felt different. Like the ground itself held stories that didn't want to be forgotten. What stayed with me wasn't just the violence or the deaths. It was the aftermath. The way life went on around those moments. The way people adapted, coped, or quietly broke under the weight of what they had witnessed or heard. The neighbors who couldn't unhear the gunshots. The ones who lay awake at night, replaying sounds they wished they could erase. The child who would grow up without parents, carrying a loss he never chose. The tiles that never quite returned to white, no matter how much effort went into cleaning them. It taught me something about how fragile normalcy really is. We move through spaces assuming they're neutral, safe, ordinary. But sometimes, just beneath that surface, there are layers of grief, violence, and despair that don't announce themselves. They exist quietly, embedded in walls, floors, and memories. Some places carry what happened there, whether you acknowledge it or not, and sometimes, even when everything looks clean and quiet again, you can still feel it. Not as fear exactly, but as a subtle unease, a sense that something fractured there once, and the crack never fully closed. That neighborhood is far behind me now. I don't walk those hallways or cross those tiled floors anymore. But when I think about it, those stories rise to the surface first. Not the good days, not the ordinary moments. The ones that revealed how quickly lives can unravel, and how close we can be to tragedy without ever realizing it. They're reminders I didn't ask for, but they stayed with me anyway. And I don't think they ever really leave. I had a friend who once told me a story that has stayed with me ever since. It wasn't dramatic in the way people usually expect scary stories to be. There was no violence, no screaming, no moment where everything exploded into chaos. That's part of what made it so disturbing. It was quiet, personal, unfinished. The kind of story that doesn't end when you stop talking about it, but instead follows you into the quiet moments of your own life. He was a teenager when it happened. His mom needed to go stay at her mother's house for a few days. The house had been in the family for generations, and it was old in a way that felt deeper than just age. Not charming old, not nostalgic old. It was heavy with time. The floors creaked even when no one was walking on them. The hallways were narrow and seemed to swallow sound. Doors never quite closed the way they should. Even during the day, the light didn't fully reach the corners of the rooms, as if the house preferred shadows. His mom didn't want to go alone. She didn't explain it clearly, and she didn't need to. She just said she didn't feel right about being there by herself. There was hesitation in her voice, the kind that comes from intuition rather than logic. So my friend went with her. He didn't love the idea, but he agreed. He figured it would be a few boring days, maybe a little uncomfortable, but nothing serious. They arrived in the afternoon. They carried their bags inside and tried to make the place feel normal again. His grandmother wasn't there at the time, which made the house feel strange. Not abandoned exactly, just empty in a way that felt intentional. Like the house was aware people had returned but hadn't decided how it felt about it. They made dinner. They watched television. They talked about small, ordinary things. Everything felt forced but calm. Eventually, they got ready for bed. There weren't enough proper bedrooms, so his mom took one of the back rooms, and my friend slept on the couch in the living room. He didn't mind that part. In fact, he preferred it. The living room felt more open, more central. He felt less trapped there than he would have in one of the narrow bedrooms. When the lights were turned off, the house changed. It settled into itself. Pops and creaks echoed softly through the walls. Something ticked faintly somewhere, mechanical and slow. The air felt thicker, harder to breathe. My friend lay on the couch, staring up at the ceiling, listening. He wasn't scared. Exactly. But he was alert. Like some part of him knew this was a place where you didn't fully relax. At some point in the night, he heard footsteps. They came from the hallway. They were slow and deliberate, not rushed, not heavy, just steady steps moving along the old floorboards. His first thought was that it was his mom getting up to use the bathroom. The hallway connected her bedroom to the bathroom and passed right by the living room. That explanation made sense. It was comforting, even. He didn't want her to know he was still awake. It felt childish but instinctive. So he closed his eyes and stayed perfectly still, breathing evenly, pretending to be asleep. The footsteps kept coming. Each step grew clearer as they got closer. He could hear the faint shift of weight, the subtle sound of someone moving through the house. Everything about it felt normal, familiar, almost reassuring. Until the footsteps stopped. They stopped right beside the couch. He stayed frozen, eyes shut tight, body rigid. He waited for the sound of her turning toward the bathroom, or maybe a soft whisper, or the sound of footsteps continuing down the hall. Instead, there was nothing. Just silence. Then he felt it. Breath. Warm breath brushed across his forehead. It was close enough that he could feel the air move against his skin. Close enough that whoever it was had to be leaning over him. His mind scrambled for explanations. His first thought was that his mom was checking on him. Maybe about to give him a goodnight kiss, the way she used to when he was younger. But something was wrong. The breath lingered. Too long. There was no familiar scent. No rustle of clothes. No quiet voice saying his name. Just the steady presence of someone breathing inches from his face. His heart was pounding so hard he thought it might give him away. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to open his eyes, to jump up. But something deeper told him not to. He was suddenly terrified of what he might see if he did. So he stayed still. After what felt like forever, the breath stopped. He felt the presence straighten up. The weight shifted slightly. Then the footsteps resumed, moving away from the couch and back down the hallway. He stayed exactly where he was, eyes still closed, body locked in place. Long after the sound faded, he didn't move. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night. He didn't turn on a light. He didn't call out to his mom. He just lay there, replaying the moment over and over in his head. A morning eventually came. Sunlight filled the living room. The house looked harmless in the daylight, just old, just quiet. The fear from the night before felt unreal in the brightness, like a nightmare that didn't quite make sense anymore. At breakfast, he asked his mom, as casually as he could, why she had checked on him during the night. She stopped what she was doing and looked at him, confused. She told him she hadn't left her room. She said she'd had a bad feeling the moment they arrived. Something about the house made her uneasy, especially at night. She admitted she had locked her bedroom door and stayed in bed, too afraid to even get up to use the bathroom. She hadn't slept much either. When he told her what he had experienced, the color drained from her face. She didn't laugh. She didn't tell him he imagined it. She didn't try to explain it away. She just listened. Then she told him they wouldn't talk about it anymore. They stayed for the rest of the visit, but everything felt different. They kept lights on at night. They avoided certain rooms. They moved through the house quickly, as if not wanting to linger. Neither of them slept well. A few months later, his grandmother passed away. They had to return to the house to pack up her belongings. This time, it wasn't a temporary visit. The house was being closed for good. During the day, it was manageable, sad but normal. They sorted through old furniture, family photos, boxes filled with forgotten things. The house felt empty, but calm, like it was finally letting go. As soon as the sun began to set, everything shifted. The air grew heavier. Shadows stretched too long across the walls. The sounds seemed sharper, louder. Even his mom admitted she felt it immediately, like something had changed the moment daylight faded. They didn't wait to see if the feeling would pass. That night, they packed up what they could and went to stay in a motel. Neither of them wanted to sleep in that house again. Not after what had happened. Not after the way it felt when the light disappeared. My friend told me that sometimes he still thinks about that night on the couch. About how close whatever it was came to him. About how real it felt. About the warmth of breath on his skin. He wonders what he would have seen if he had opened his eyes. And that question, unanswered and unanswerable, is what scares him the most. Because some things don't need to hurt you physically to leave a mark. Some things just need to stand close enough for you to feel them breathing. In the 1840s, westward expansion was fueled by hope. Families packed up their lives and headed toward California, believing they were chasing something better. Land was advertised as fertile and plentiful. Opportunity felt limitless. The idea of starting fresh, of building something new far away from crowded cities and limited prospects, pulled thousands of people across the continent. On paper, it sounded like a promise. In reality, it was a gamble with lives at stake. The Donner Party was made up of families, couples, children, and individuals who believed that promise. They weren't reckless thrill seekers. They were people trying to improve their circumstances, just like countless others at the time. Many had saved for years, sold what little they had, and placed all their faith in the journey west. They traveled by wagon, moving slowly across vast distances, trusting maps that were often incomplete or flat out wrong. The danger of that journey is hard to fully grasp from a modern perspective. Today, we cross the same terrain in hours, protected by roads, weather forecasts, and rescue services. Back then, travelers faced mountains, deserts, rivers, and weather patterns they barely understood. Every mile came with risk. Still, most groups made it through by sticking to known routes and timing their travel carefully. The Donner Party didn't. They made a series of decisions that on their own might not have been fatal. But together, they created a perfect storm. One of the most devastating choices was taking an untested shortcut that promised to save time. It didn't. Instead, it slowed them down drastically. Wagons broke. Terrain was rougher than expected. Progress became painfully slow. Days turned into weeks, and weeks slipped away as winter crept closer. That delay sealed their fate. By the time they reached the Sierra Nevada mountains, winter had already begun to assert itself. Snow came early and came hard. What might have been a manageable crossing in better conditions became impossible. The snow piled up relentlessly, burying trails, blocking passes, and trapping the group in place. Wagons couldn't move. Animals collapsed from exhaustion and hunger. The mountains became walls instead of landmarks. They were completely cut off. There was no path forward and no realistic way to turn back. Supplies dwindled faster than anyone had prepared for. Food that was meant to last weeks disappeared in days. At first, they tried to be careful. They rationed. They hunted when they could. They stretched what little they had as far as possible. They boiled hides, chewed leather, and ate anything remotely edible. But winter didn't end. Snow kept falling. Temperatures dropped. Hunger gnawed at everyone constantly. Children cried from starvation. Adults grew thinner and weaker, watching their families suffer and knowing there was no rescue coming anytime soon. Every day became a calculation. Who eats today? Who can go without? Who might survive if someone else doesn't? Eventually, people began to die. Illness, exposure, and starvation claimed them one by one. Death wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was slow and inevitable. Bodies weakened. Spirits broke. Hope faded. And for the people still alive, death brought with it a terrifying question they never imagined they would face. What do you do when the only thing left between you and death is a line you swore you would never cross? When the living realized that survival might require using the bodies of those who had already died, some of them made a choice that history would never let them forget. They resorted to cannibalism. Not out of cruelty, not out of madness, not because they wanted to, but because hunger leaves no room for dignity or moral comfort. It reduces existence to its most basic form: eat or die. That is what makes the Donner Party's story so disturbing. These were not monsters hiding in the wilderness. They were parents trying to keep their children alive. They were siblings watching each other waste away. They were neighbors who had shared meals and laughter before the journey began. Starvation stripped away everything else and left only survival. Some people refused and died. Others crossed that line and lived. There is no clean way to judge either choice. History often tries to separate heroes from villains, but this story resists that. It exists in a gray space that is deeply uncomfortable, because it forces us to imagine ourselves there. What would you do if your child was starving in front of you? What would you do if you knew that help was not coming? What would you do if tomorrow looked exactly like today, only colder and more hopeless? Only a small number of the Donner Party survived the winter. When rescue efforts finally reached the camps, what they found shocked the nation. The details were hard to speak about, harder to print, and impossible to forget. The idea that Americans, a pioneers chasing opportunity, had been driven to cannibalism shattered romantic ideas about the frontier. The Donner Party became a symbol of the darkest side of westward expansion. Their story cut through the myth of endless opportunity and revealed the brutal reality beneath it. The American frontier wasn't just courage and progress. It was suffering, isolation, miscalculation, and death. Over the years, the story has been retold many times. Books, documentaries, Lectures and films have tried to capture what happened. One depiction that left a lasting impression on me was the movie 17 Miracles. The film addresses the Donner Party early on, and while it doesn't dwell on every detail, the imagery is haunting. Seeing the snow, the isolation, and the exhaustion on people's faces makes it harder to keep emotional distance. Visualizing it changes everything. The endless white, the silence, the way snow absorbs sound until the world feels deadened and unreal. The realization that winter isn't ending, that help isn't coming, and that survival will demand something unthinkable. Seeing it depicted makes it easier to understand how hope slowly eroded into despair. What makes the Donner Party especially tragic is how much of it might have been avoided. A different route, better timing, a refusal to trust an unproven shortcut. Even a small change could have altered the outcome. Instead, a chain of choices led them straight into disaster. It's tempting to judge them from the comfort of the present, to say they should have known better, to say they made foolish decisions. But hindsight is merciless and unfair. They were working with limited information, false promises, and pressure to keep moving. Many other groups took risks and survived. This one didn't. That's what makes it frightening. The difference between survival and catastrophe wasn't courage or morality. It was timing, geography, and luck. When I think about the Donner Party now, what stays with me most is the quietness of their suffering. Snow muffles sound. Mountains isolate. People died slowly in frozen cabins while the rest of the world continued on, unaware. Somewhere else, life went on as usual. Children were born, crops were harvested, cities grew. And up in the mountains, people were fading away, one by one. There's something deeply unsettling about that disconnect. The Donner Party forces us to confront how thin the veneer of civilization really is, how quickly rules, ethics, and social structures can collapse when basic needs aren't met. Hunger and cold don't negotiate. They don't care who you are or what you believe. They strip life down to instinct. It's also a reminder that history isn't always heroic. Some chapters don't fit neatly into narratives of bravery and triumph. Some are warnings rather than celebrations. They exist to remind us of our limits, our vulnerability, and the cost of ignoring nature and chance. Every time I think about the Donner Party, I imagine the silence, the waiting, the moment when people realized spring wasn't coming soon enough, the knowledge that the world they knew was slipping away, replaced by something raw and brutal. It's not a story you tell for entertainment. It's a story you sit with, one that challenges comfort and certainty. Oh, the one that makes you uneasy, not because it's shocking, but because it's human. Once you truly understand it, it doesn't fade. It becomes part of how you think about survival, history, and the fragile line between morality and necessity. This story didn't happen to me directly, but it was told to me by someone I trust deeply, and it has stayed with me in a way very few things ever have. Not because it was loud or violent or shocking in the usual sense, but because of how calm and deliberate everything was. There was no panic, no hysteria, no dramatic moment where someone screamed or ran. Instead, there was a slow, steady realization, followed by a quiet decision to walk away from a place that had stopped feeling safe. It began with a couple who, by all accounts, were genuinely good people, kind, patient, thoughtful, the type of parents who listened when their child spoke, who didn't dismiss fears as imagination or brush things off as just a phase. They had a young son, still small enough that his world revolved around bedtime routines, familiar toys, and the comfort of knowing his parents were nearby. Then he started hearing voices. At first, It didn't seem alarming. Kids say strange things sometimes. He told his parents that someone was talking in his room, whispering. When they asked what the voices were saying, he couldn't explain clearly. It was vague, disconnected. His parents did what most responsible parents would do. They checked the obvious possibilities. Pipes in the walls, wind brushing against the house, the normal noises older homes make at night. They reassured him, stayed with him until he fell asleep, and assumed it would pass. It didn't. Night after night, the boy grew more distressed. He became afraid of bedtime. He didn't want to be left alone in his room. He would wake up crying, shaking, insisting the voices had come back. His sleep deteriorated. His behavior changed. He became anxious in a way that was impossible to ignore. This wasn't a child inventing stories or seeking attention. He was genuinely frightened. His parents took it seriously. They went the responsible route first. Doctors, specialists, evaluations. They wanted to rule out anything medical or psychological. Hearing problems, anxiety disorders, early signs of hallucinations. Everything came back normal. His development was fine. His mental health showed no red flags. There was nothing that explained what he was describing. So they turned their attention back to the house. They hired professionals. Plumbers to check the pipes. Electricians to inspect wiring and outlets. Anyone who might be able to explain strange sounds traveling through walls. The first electrician went through the house carefully. He checked circuits, junction boxes, fixtures. He found nothing unusual. He suggested that sound can sometimes travel in strange ways, especially in older homes, but he couldn't identify a clear source. The voices continued. As the months passed, exhaustion settled over the household. Sleep was fragmented. Stress built quietly. At some point, they had another child. Not just because of the situation, of course, but they hoped it might help. That their son wouldn't feel so alone. That having another presence in the house might change whatever dynamic was at play. For a short while, things seemed better. Then the baby started having trouble sleeping too. Long nights, constant crying. Everyone was exhausted. One night, when things were especially bad, the father decided to take the baby monitor and sleep in his older son's room so his wife could get a few hours of uninterrupted rest. He didn't expect anything unusual. He had spent plenty of nights in that room before, sitting beside the bed, calming his son's fears. He lay down, tired, focused on sleep. And then he heard it, whispering, low, indistinct, but unmistakable. It wasn't loud enough to make out words, but it was clearly more than one voice. They overlapped slightly, close together, coming from somewhere near the wall and the window. Not outside, not clearly inside the room either. Somewhere in between. He sat up. He listened. The voices didn't stop. They didn't sound like pipes, knocking or wind pushing through gaps. There was rhythm to them, cadence, the unmistakable texture of human whispering. The kind of sound your brain recognizes immediately, even when you don't want to. He didn't wake his son. He stayed still, listening, trying to find a rational explanation, trying to convince himself there had to be one. But the longer he listened, the more certain he became that what his child had been describing all along was real. The next morning, they called another electrician. This is where my friend enters the story. He was the second electrician brought in after the first one found nothing. He went in skeptical, as any professional would. He'd heard plenty of stories about strange noises that ended up being mundane. He wasn't dismissive, but he wasn't expecting anything extraordinary either. By the time he arrived, the room had already been completely emptied. No bed, no toys, no furniture, no decorations, just bare walls. A window and an uneasy silence. At first. Then they stood in a specific spot, between the window and the adjoining wall, and they heard it, whispering, faint but clear enough that there was no mistaking it. It wasn't coming from the ceiling or the floor. It wasn't traveling through vents. It felt localized, concentrated in that one section of the room. My friend did what he knew how to do. He shut off the main power to the entire house. Not just the room, everything, every circuit. Total electrical silence. The voices continued. He checked for the obvious next. He accessed the roof cavity. He inspected wall spaces where possible. He used cameras to look into voids that weren't easily reachable. He checked for hidden speakers, rogue wiring, anything that could transmit sound. There was nothing. No devices, no animals. No structural explanation that made sense. And still, standing in that same place, you could hear whispering. At that point, my friend suggested the next logical step, removing the wall. Not dramatically, not urgently, just matter of fact. If the sound was coming from inside the wall, opening it up was the only way to know for sure what was there. The parents declined. They didn't argue. They didn't panic. They didn't demand more tests or another opinion. They simply said they were leaving. They had already decided. The cost of tearing open walls, of continuing to search for explanations, of subjecting their children to more nights of fear, wasn't worth it. Whatever was happening in that house, whether it could be explained or not, had crossed the line. They packed up and moved out. They didn't wait to sell. They didn't try to fix the problem. They chose uncertainty somewhere else over certainty in a place that no longer felt safe. My friend finished what he could, wrote his report, and walked away. When he told me the story later, he didn't embellish it. He didn't frame it as something supernatural. He told it plainly, professionally, but there was something in his voice that stuck with me, a hesitation, a quiet discomfort. He was someone who dealt in wires, circuits, measurable things. This wasn't that. What unsettles me most isn't the idea of voices in the walls. It's the process. Every rational step was taken. Medical causes ruled out. Environmental explanations investigated. Power cut, walls checked, professionals involved, nothing ignored, nothing rushed. And still, the voices were there. There was no final reveal, no explanation that tied everything together. Just a family deciding that sometimes the safest choice is to stop asking questions and leave. I think about that child often, about how terrifying it must have been to hear something no one else believed at first, about the relief he must have felt when his father finally heard it too. And I think about how thin the line is between what we understand and what we don't. Some houses are just houses, and some, for reasons we may never fully grasp, are not. If you're still here, then these stories didn't simply fade away. They settled in. Every story you heard tonight came from real moments, real people, and real situations where something felt off or nearly went wrong. If you want to keep exploring stories that linger in your thoughts long after the night grows quiet, consider subscribing to Midnight Whispers. There are more stories waiting in the dark, and not all of them let you leave in time.